Coming up on UGTV. A special session of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas.
All right, good evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and I welcome our Wyandotte County Legislative Delegation. Thank you for being here. I'd ask the clerk to announce the meeting and call the roll.
A special session is being held on Thursday, November 21st, 2019 at 5:00 p.m. in the fifth floor conference room for a legislative program and dinner. Immediately following the 7 p.m. commission meeting, the commission will recess from the commission chambers to the ninth floor conference room for an executive session regarding the administrator's review. Roll call. Townsend.
Here.
McKiernan.
Here.
Mugia. Johnson. Kane.
Here.
Markley.
Here.
Walters.
Here.
Philbrook.
Here.
Bynum.
Here.
Burrows.
Here.
Alvey.
Here. Could we have the volume turned up just a little bit? I think that might help. Yep, I'm a little deaf. Commissioner Kane, don't need to laugh about that. You should know, you grew up with a big family too. All right. All right, tonight we'll hear a presentation regarding the 2020 Unified Governments Legislative Program. I'll turn it over to Administrator Bach.
Thank you, Mayor. Annually, we try to reach out to our delegation with the state and have you come in so we can talk through a few of the ideas that we are proposing this year or issues that would like to take forward to the state. So what we'll do is Mike Taylor will give a presentation of the different items, and then we would open it to any kind of discussion or any other thing we'd like to get into on the topics there, or if you have other ideas that maybe you think we should be looking at that maybe we don't have in our program. So I'll turn that over to Mike Taylor, and you can present it.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners, and Honorable Legislative Delegation. I appreciate you being here. We'll talk about the state issues first, and then I want to hit a few quick things on the federal agenda. So we'll start with kind of a legislative landscape of what we're looking at going into the session. We do get reports that revenues are increasing for now, but shortfalls are predicted within the next 2 years, and that's a little iffy depending if there's a recession or not a recession. But the fact is, even though we're seeing increases in revenues, the state is still spending more money than it's taking in. So that's going to create an issue that'll have to be dealt with. The fact that revenues are showing an increase, I think, will continue the push by the majority party in the legislature to want to cut taxes. That was a big issue last year, and the governor vetoed bills that would have done that. I think the governor's view is we need to build up those revenues and fund services that have fallen short over a number of years, so there'll be a struggle over whether to cut taxes or leave them where they are. Property appraisal reform will be a big issue, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. That is, I guess the colloquial phrase for that is the dark store theory, although it's not exactly accurate, but that's kind of what it's been identified as. We'll talk about that. Medicaid expansion, I was in a meeting in Topeka just yesterday. That is getting a big push. We think something will happen this year on Medicaid expansion. Of course, it passed 3 years ago, and then Governor Brownback vetoed it. The House passed a version last year. The Senate wouldn't take it up. Now the Senate is looking at it. But I got a briefing yesterday on the different options that the Senate's looking at, and some of them are really not very desirable. So we'll be figuring out, the big coalitions working that, we'll be figuring a strategy on how we address that. Public rights-of-way will be a big fight. It started last year over expansion of 5G and the ability for us to control our own right-of-ways. We'll talk more about that. Sports betting is getting some traction. States around us have approved that. Our legislature's been looking at it for more than a year since the Supreme Court ruling. I think we'll see action on that. And legalizing medical marijuana is likely to happen this year too. So that's kind of a landscape of some of the big issues that we see. Our top priority issue, and I'm going to go through our priority issues, is the property appraisal reform. So we do support appraisals based on fair market value as historically used in Kansas statute. And there's actually a definition of fair market value in the statute, which basically says it is the price that a willing buyer will pay to a willing seller for that property. That's how fair market value. So that's why our appraisers look at comparables. So if my house, if I sell it for $200,000, that's going to be the fair market value of that house because somebody willingly agreed to pay that for it. The problem that we've seen is more with commercial properties, and we would like to see a change in statute that says that fair market value does not include hypothetical lease fee. That's the dark store theory. That's where someone, and it's happened in a number of cases to us and particularly down in Johnson County as well, but it's starting to spread, where a big box store, for example, will be valued at $10 million and they appeal to the Board of Tax Appeals, and the Board of Tax Appeals says, yeah, it's only worth $3 million. And that has been a trend that is continuing and continuing. And these tax representatives have made a case with the dark store theory. And one thing to keep in mind with them is they're very entrepreneurial, but they work on a commission. So if they can get a whole bunch of big box stores or a chain to come in and get all of them to appeal their taxes, and they get the taxes cut from $100,000 to $50,000, that tax rep gets a cut of that. So it's very profitable for them to do. They have no reason not to file it. And for the company, if they can get those taxes reduced, then why not? So that's been what we've been facing. And it's been a problem that's starting to spread all over the state. We also favor procedural changes to the tax appeals process that are balanced and sensible. We believe that state law should require the Board of Tax Appeals to adhere to the same rules, guidelines, and accepted practices that county appraisers are required to follow. That's not happening now with the Board of Tax Appeals. And I will just kind of bluntly say, they just kind of make up numbers, and they don't follow any accepted appraisal practices. And the dark store theory is not an accepted appraisal practice anywhere in any appraiser manual or book anywhere. So the other thing that was done a few years ago that we'd like to see changed is we used to, as a county government, be able to appeal a decision to the district court. The legislature prohibited us from doing that, but they do allow the taxpayer to still go to district court in what became a de novo trial or with new facts. And so we believe that we should be able to have the same right as that taxpayer to appeal a case to the district court. So those are some changes that we are going to be promoting along with a number of other counties. We're not sure exactly of our strategy, whether we will introduce legislation. We're still kind of debating that because that could backfire on us. But we also have heard rumors that the tax reps that are pushing the dark store may come to the legislature with their own bill and try to codify that theory into state law and actually put hypothetical lease fee language into the statute, which would undermine what traditionally has been fair market value. So that's going to be a big fight. Yes.
So you might want to share with them what the major conversation was down at the Kansas Association of Counties, that basically that was what took up the most of the time for a full hour almost about how the whole state of Kansas is going to deal with this. Because when you get out into the rural areas, you have the one big box store, Walmart. And, and then that's going to rip out from underneath all of those little towns, their tax base. So the whole state's up in arms about it. They're really worried.
They are. And I've had meetings with the League of Municipalities has adopted, not this exact language, but in principle, the same effect. I've talked to the school boards, and I've also talked just yesterday, in fact, with the Association of Community Colleges, because they were kind of missing this on their radar, and they now understand that this is not just a county issue. It undermines everybody's tax base, the states, the community colleges, public schools. So it really is a threat to our entire tax base and the revenues that we used to pay for all the services people want. So this is going to be a real hot issue, and it's been building and kind of boiling over the past couple of years, and we think this year we'll see some real action on that.
Yes,
The other thing I
Kathy.
will point out that is also part of our strategy, which is not legislative, but two members of the Board of Tax Appeals, their terms are expiring, and Governor Kelly will get to appoint two new members come January. And I know Mayor Alvey and other mayors have met with her to discuss this issue and kind of put it on her radar. So it could be that changing the members of the Board of Tax Appeals could help in this problem as well. Yes.
I just had a question. So if the legislature codified that, would the Board of Tax Appeals have it, even if we get a more local government-friendly people on there, would they be able to do anything about that if it was codified into law?
Well,
Yeah, that's interesting because currently they're not following accepted guidelines and practices that the county appraisers. You would assume that when you move to the state level, you would follow the same processes and guidelines that the county appraisal so that it would be consistent and fair, equitable, but they're not doing that. So the problem is with the Board of Tax Appeals, but then should there be legislation which would codify it, would they be free? They could be because they already are violating, but I would think they'd be under some kind of, need to follow.
Yeah.
Just to be consistent. The problem with this is, and just so people understand, is if these things continue to go through the Board of Tax Appeals and the assessment on commercial buildings like Walmarts and CVS and Walgreens continues to follow the hypothetical lease fee, these are the hypothetical lease fee, we're not going to get those taxes. That burden is going to shift to every other taxing, anybody else who's taxed. So it's going to shift now to residents. So we'll still have to get the revenues necessary to run our operations. We're just simply going to have to shift the burden to manufacturers, but then manufacturers will simply employ the attorneys as well. They'll follow the same process because they'll have the money, the funds to hire these attorneys, and the process will continue. The only ones who won't be able to access this will be residents, frankly, and small businesses.
right. And
Another issue, though, is if this was incorporated into a statutory change, that would kind of change the framework of any appeal. If we appeal Board of Tax Appeals decision, because right now they have some discretion in how they make that determination, and they can use this theory. If it's prohibited in the statute, then our basis on appeal would be a lot different.
And to follow up on the mayor's point, there is concern that if the big box stores keep having success with this, other businesses, small mom and pops, could start looking at this. Manufacturers could start looking at this. I'm quite honestly surprised that some of the big grocery store chains haven't picked up on this. And, you know, quite honestly, and this is a bit of a hyperbole example, but, you know, I have a 4-bedroom house, but there's only 2 of us, so why should I pay full tax value on those 2 bedrooms I don't use? So I could use dark house theory, right? Probably not likely to happen, but if you carry this out to far enough, why not try it? The next issue, Medicaid expansion, which has been a priority issue for us for 5 years now. We are continuing to support that, and like I said in my opening remarks, it depends on what kind of version of this bill we see. The Senate version, which is coming from Majority Leader Jim Denning, Senator Denning, 2 of his options would only allow, under the law, under the Affordable Care Act, and what most states have done, is poverty level up to 138%. His 2 options say only up to 100%. And he would ask, under that version, would ask the federal government then for a waiver that would say, well, we only want to cover people up to 100% of poverty, but you still want we want you to fund, as the federal government, 90% of the cost. Federal government is not likely to do that, and they've not done it anywhere else. So we think that's a bit of an obstructionist sort of proposal. We think that and when I say we, I think us and this coalition, broad coalition of organizations that are working on Medicaid expansion, would support 138%, make it clean, make it simple, quit throwing blockades in the way like work requirements. And the other thing that Senator Denning's proposals include is a lockout provision. So you would have to pay a premium of up to 5%, which again violates some of the federal mandates that are out there or guidelines that are out there. So that would be for a family of 4 with the poverty guidelines of up to 100% would be $50 a month. Well, under the provision that's in the proposal now, if you miss 2 months of that premium, you'd be locked out of Medicare for 6 months. So you'd be on the program, off the program, maybe never get back on it. If you're in the midst of getting treatment for a disease, you'd suddenly be locked out of getting coverage for that. And so we don't think that's very workable. So we're just going to have to work through those details and see. But at least we've got the traditional opposition over the years saying we're willing to talk about it. So we'll see how seriously that happens. But for the stress, I want to stress for us that expansion, we estimate, would provide insurance coverage or the ability to get insurance for an additional 10,000 Wyandotte County residents. We think it would bring almost $68 million in annual new healthcare spending, and it would create hundreds of new healthcare jobs. Healthcare is a major industry for Wyandotte County. And keep in mind, KU Hospital and Providence are writing off tens of millions of dollars a year in uncompensated care because these citizens are being treated, but they're not able to get the Medicaid. So big issue. We're hoping that we'll get it accomplished this year. Public right-of-way. So this fight started, and it involves federal government mandates as well. This has to do with using our public right-of-ways, land that we are stewards of, that's owned by the public, that we feel that we should have a right to control, where you can put those pipes and those wires and those poles. And what's really been pushing this is the expansion of 5G broadband with these little boxes that they have to put in, because unlike the big phone towers with 5G, these transmitter boxes, which are about like this, have to go every 1,500 feet. So you could see these things hanging from every pole eventually. And now the cable companies have expanded into mobile phone, cell phone service. And we saw cases last year where the Cox Communication, which is the city of Wichita's primary cable provider, wanted to start hanging boxes off the wires in between the two poles. So here comes the wire, and they wanted to be hanging these boxes off without any regulation, without having to get permits. And so we're watching that very closely. We're going to see that bill again this year. The federal government, meanwhile, through the FCC, has issued some guidelines, and I'm recommending that we would oppose codifying those into state law, and we're going to see a move to do that. And there's an illustration because it's a complex issue. Here's kind of what we're talking about. So on the top pipe, a conduit, you see video services, cable TV, streaming, Netflix, that kind of thing. So already we have franchises for cable TV service. So that money comes through and comes out the end. But voice over internet protocol, phone service, internet service, streaming cable, we're not able to get the franchise fees on that. So it's falling out of the pipe. And with telecom, it's kind of the same thing. So basically what we'll end up being able to do is collect franchise fee only on cable TV and landline phone service. Well, landline phone service is going away, and cable TV is becoming less and less because people are streaming now more. So it is a threat to a revenue source that we've traditionally considered. That's another aspect of this. And the argument that the cable folks make, kind of the analogy we've used is with adding the 5G and not having to pay for adding these boxes or using the right-of-way for that, is it would be kind of like if I went to the Legends movie theater and I paid to see the 7 o'clock movie, but then I'm like, well, I've already paid to see the 7, I want to see the 10 o'clock show too, but I shouldn't have to buy another ticket. I should just be able to walk down the hall and go into that other theater and watch that movie for free. Well, no, it shouldn't work that way. But our argument is that 5G service is an entirely different service, a new service, and you should have to pay some kind of compensation for using our right-of-way for that as well. So that's going to be that issue, and I think that'll be a big fight because they'll be very well funded. Star bonds, the 5-year approval of star bonds that was done a few years ago expires this year. So we have to get the star bond legislation renewed or star bonds will go away. I think there will be some opposition to renewing star bonds from some folks. Most people would want to renew star bonds, and I think they'll probably be renewed. Our concern is, as the language says in the lower part, is that we want to make sure that whatever star bond legislation, the new policy, remains flexible and does not include unnecessary restrictions. There are some, particularly on the Senate side, in the Commerce Committee, that have proposed changes to star bonds that would make them unusable or very difficult to use. So while they might approve them again, they might be so difficult and burdensome that we wouldn't really be able to use them. So we want to make sure that what gets passed is still workable. And we also threw in here on economic development, that last line, we encourage the legislature to work with local governments in developing innovative economic development tools. I mean, local governments are where that economic growth is really happening, in partnership with the state, of course, but we want to make sure that remains possible and easy to do, and maybe some new innovative tools. Internet sales tax collections, the Supreme Court cleared the way for this with the Wayfair decision. The state does not have legislation yet that actually explains how we're going to do that, and so we're just simply, and this has been our program for years, we think as a matter of fairness to Main Street businesses that as more and more people buy over the internet, all kinds of services, that those sales tax should be paid on those. And the Supreme Court has said that can happen. So now it's a matter of figuring out exactly how that happens. And part of that debate will be origin-based versus destination-based. And there's some legislation that's been introduced. The KCK Chamber has been pushing this for a couple of years. The State Chamber has. And here's the difference. So, and I'll use one of our own stores, Nebraska Furniture Mart. So if I have a pickup truck and I drive to Nebraska Furniture Mart and buy a 50-inch big screen TV and can put it in the back of my pickup, the sales tax that I pay on that TV stays here in KCK. If I have a small little car, like a Prius, and I can't get it home and Nebraska Furniture Mart delivers it to my home in Prairie Village, the sales tax goes to Prairie Village. That's destination-based. And so the way that's also working with the internet is a small business here in KCK, if they're doing business around the country, would have to know thousands of different sales tax codes and figure out, what is the sales tax code for that particular city or that neighborhood of that city that I'm selling in. So that's going to be part of, I think, part of this discussion. And quite honestly, if we went back to an origin-based, it would be beneficial to us because all the sales, for example, from Village West would stay here regardless of whether it was delivered or taken and picked up. So that's going to be the issue there. Plus, now with more downloading, we've included that digital goods, people are subscribing to the newspaper digitally, audio streaming, Spotify, downloading your music, video, games. Those all cost, and we think sales tax should be paid and collected on those as well. I would predict that medical marijuana will be legalized this year in Kansas. All of our surrounding states have approved it in one form or another. We have said that if the state chooses to do that, we're leaving that to the state decision. I think the recommended language, and this was in last year too, was that local governments should be allowed, because there will be sales tax on it, we should be allowed to collect our local sales tax on those sales. And that we should also have the ability to opt in or out of, through our planning, whether we want to have dispensaries in our city. We don't believe that the state should mandate that to us, so it would be a local decision. Do we want to have those growing facilities or those dispensaries located in KCK, or do we not? And it would be decided through our local processes, through local ordinance. Sports betting, yes, we've supported this for a couple of years, and it's kind of gotten into a big fight over exactly how it gets implemented. There is strong support for implementing it. It's just a matter of exactly how you do it and who gets all the money. Our position is that, again, if they do that, we should receive a share of the revenues generated by expanded gaming, the same as we do from the casino or would from any other kind of gaming facility that opens. This one is a new one that the Association of Counties, the League of Municipalities, and the Mental Community Health Associations are all pushing, as well as our own health department, allocating for additional resources, meaning money, for behavioral health programs, and allocating those funds for, and we're talking about state dollars, for community mental health centers and additional bed space for psychiatric patients to reduce the number of people with behavioral or substance abuse issues who are inappropriately incarcerated in county jails. There are a lot of people in our county jail, in county jails all over the state, that really shouldn't be there, but there's nowhere else for them to go because there aren't enough treatment facilities or psychiatric beds, and the state has really cut back on that funding over a number of years, and so we would support that large group effort to advocate for more funding. This is one the health department asked for, and it particularly hits us because of our high rate of sexually transmitted diseases in Wyandotte County. Kansas is only one of 6 states which does not have what's called expedited partner therapy. And what that really is, if someone comes to our health department and is diagnosed with a sexually transmittable disease, we cannot issue them the antibiotics to take home to their partner. And most states are allowed to do that. Our health department would like, in statute, made it clear, because you can treat that patient that came to the health department, but if they go home and their sexual partner isn't being treated, you haven't really cured anything, right? It's just going to continue the disease. So they would like to have specific legislation that would say, yes, it's okay for you, without having to have a doctor do it. The health department could just say, all right, here, take these antibiotics home to your partner and have them start taking it. So that's a health issue that it would be a big deal for Wyandotte County because of our high rate of sexually transmitted diseases, which, by the way, are spreading all over the state. Yes, sir.
You see that as a major issue. What about the onus on the person who has the partner with the sexually transmitted disease? Where does the individuality and the ownership of that come in at? Because, my wife being a provider, people will ask for other things to be able to take home medication that's usually prescribed. I think what's going to happen is we're going to be opening a slippery slope along those lines for medications to be dispensed for somebody who's not present. How do you document that they do have a partner? They could be a random, go around and have a bunch of partners. Then what do you do? How do you determine? Would be my question.
And I would say that I think the health department would have to develop those procedures, and I think they already have ideas on how to do that. And what we're talking about, quite honestly, is antibiotics. So it's not like OxyContin or some kind of drug that, could be.
It is now, but, there's certain things that you look at as providers need to be. Antibiotics, to a certain level, antibiotics can lose their effectiveness after their saturation. So I think it needs to be discussed more, but yeah.
Right.
And I might add too, I mean, had some discussion with this with our health department director, because it's one that they feel very strong about. And it's not like we would be reinventing a wheel with all this too. I think 44 of the 50 states already allow this today. So there's a program out there that's been established in other areas that I've not heard where it's become a major problem with issuing out the additional antibiotics. Antibiotics go to them where then the partner is not able to. But what we do know for certain is it is a continuing cycle in our community with the transmitted diseases. So we know that's a major problem for us now.
Okay. Another health issue that this was a request of the health department to put in, it'll be a large group coalition. There will be legislation introduced to make the tobacco 21, which, by the way, KCK, government was the first in the state to adopt that some years ago, that if you're not 21, you can't buy tobacco or vaping products. We did that in conjunction on the very same day that Kansas City, Missouri adopted that. So the Metro, and that was very well planned and coordinated so that we both adopted that measure on the same day. Since then, Bonner and Edwardsville have adopted it. There will be an effort to make that statewide legislation, and I'm suggesting that we would support that. That way the law, while we don't always support uniform laws, it just makes sense that come from the state level. This law, by the way, was challenged by the city of Topeka, well, by a business owner in the city of Topeka, saying that the cities didn't have authority to do that. It went all the way to the state Supreme Court, who ruled under our home rule authority that cities do, in fact, have the ability to adopt these kind of ordinances. So that's one that, and I put it in the priority section just simply because we know it's going to be legislation that's introduced and one that we'll deal with.
On that point, is there any movement that any of the legislators know to regulate the sale or marketing of flavored vaping to teens and under 21? It came to me from our Board of Education, from Janet Waugh.
I think that has advanced the possibility that we may have a tobacco tax also because of that. So I think legislators are very well aware of that, especially some of the cases that have been in the media lately. So I think there is a fairly good possibility that something will be done to regulate that, and at least, and additionally maybe raise the tax on all tobacco products to help and raise it significantly to try and keep people from starting that practice.
Yes,
Wondering
Senator
if,
Haley.
Does anyone know, thank you, what their age is currently? Are they 21 now, for the sale of tobacco?
I think they may, I'm not positive, Senator, I think they may be 18 still. I'm not positive on that.
I'm concerned because I certainly support tobacco 21. I hope we all will.
Kansas City, Missouri is 21. I'm not sure about the whole state of Missouri. I'm not sure.
I just meant Kansas City, Missouri, just downtown Missouri. Thanks.
Okay.
I believe that tobacco 21 issue is going to be tied to, as Representative Moore stated, it's going to be tied to the tax issue dealing with the transportation plan too. They're going to tie all of those additional revenue sources together for a transportation plan, which will include gas tax and a few other things associated to it, which may put that tobacco 21, we know how we feel about it here in Kansas City, Kansas. The move is to at least address the tobacco issue. But when you start putting the tax on it, where those revenues will be designated to go, will be the conundrum as to what kind of support the issue gains from the full legislative body.
I agree, and I know that one of the proposals on Medicaid expansion that Senator Denning has put out includes, as part of the way to pay for that expansion, is an increase in the tobacco tax, and he would have that revenue go toward help offset the cost of Medicaid expansion. Municipal
Commissioner Kane?
utilities, I put this in because,
Commissioner Kane?
I'm sorry.
I just pulled a McKiernan. There are 5 Missouri cities, Columbia, Kansas City, Independence, Gladstone, and Grandview that adopted the ordinance. Thank you, Commissioner McKiernan.
Okay.
Right.
That's pretty good.
I put in municipal utilities because there is a huge study going on right now, a rate study of all utilities in the state, both private utilities, municipal utilities. We were included in this, and because we're one of the larger municipal utilities, they're looking at where rates are, where they fall in the region, and we wanted to reinforce the fact that, and we're in conjunction with the League of Municipalities on this, that we support the ability of cities to set and control the rates of municipal utilities. We're concerned that as this study comes back and they look at where rates are from what is now Evergy and some of the other Sunflower out west, which are private utilities, there could be some effort, and we've seen that effort in the past, to put municipal utilities like BPU under control of the KCC or try to dictate rates. And so we just wanted to, and this has been in our program, I just pulled it up a little higher because we know that legislation is underway, to make sure that we can still, at the local level, deal with that locally, under local control for our BPU. So that's why that's there.
Senator Haley?
Thank you, Mayor, and certainly I appreciate this. I've had a little interest in the BPU recently, and will continue to. The KCC, or Kansas Corporation Commission, can set some opinions that I think the city, our city, might look at by way of comparison as we look at the rate study, which will be held. We hope that part of this agenda would be to hold the line on an imbalance of different fees, whether they are the soon-to-come stormwater fees, which many of our small businesses and our ratepayers, to a lesser extent, will feel. That part of the policies that come out of this as it pertains to the BPU is to look at what opinions have been promulgated for other utilities, though they may not be municipal utilities, and to place those as a priority for easing what some consider to be a burden for our monthly electric and water bills from our jewel of a municipality. I certainly will be one of those continuing to try and see the KCC, or Kansas Corporation Commission, opinions that could relate or might relate to our constituency, though a municipal utility might somehow be applied. I also should say that there will be pending legislation to look at what percentage of unified government charges, those line items from the pilot and other entities, the waste, stormwater, what percentage of the overall bill can that be on every monthly bill? What percentage of UG charges will be on the utility bill would be something that I would hope the UG could look at a cap. It's supposed to be 15% for the pilot, but the cumulative could be so much more. And I just hope the spirit comes out from around this table and actually among our mutual constituencies, that we've got to find a way to balance the scales a little bit for the benefit of the public and our small businesses when it comes to our Board of Public Utilities, which in many people's eyes has gotten away from the public service.
Yeah, I would suggest that the methodology, trying to do this from the state level really is inconsistent with, again, one of our hopes, one of our legislative priorities is to allow local control over our taxes, our revenues, and to continually have legislators, governor, whomever, control those kinds of decisions that the local government has to make. We have oversight over those decisions. That's what our elections are for. So I would strongly oppose any attempt for the state to control rates or even the proportion of fees, what it should be as a percentage of the bill. Frankly, I think that's not workable. Yes, Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Mayor. And I was just going to say, it's from maybe more of a bird's eye view, but I was recently in Lawrence to participate in the Kansas Department of Commerce workshop for their new strat plan that they're putting together. And high utility rates was like a big issue as far as like, that is a huge detriment to economic development in our state. And on the chart that they had, it showed Wyandotte County as having very high rates. But it's really hard to do that comparison. So that's, always puts you in an awkward position trying to defend that perhaps our rates aren't as high as what some of the private utilities are. But anyway, I was just going to point that out, that is a huge issue across the state and a real detriment to economic development. And it would be great if we could have some comparison or, some way to compare our local rates to what others are paying. Thank you.
And I think, Representative, that's the point of this larger study that's going on at the state level. I think all of this position is, we just wanted to reinforce, as the mayor said, local control. We believe we should keep local control over our local utility and not have the state mandating things to us. There's one more thing we've tried, and we may get a little closer this year. This is one that I know our chief financial officer and budget director would appreciate. This has to do with when we actually have to certify and approve the budget. So we would support, along with a number of other cities, in fact, all cities, legislation that would allow adoption of local government budgets by November 30th. We would keep the August 25th deadline for certification of the amount of ad valorem tax revenue needed. So, but right now we have to work those budgets in July, approve them by early August, have the budget. This would allow us to identify the revenues, but then we can have those extra months to actually do budget workshops and figure out within that confines how we want to spend that money. So it would give us a little more time, perhaps thoughtfully, to actually assemble the budget then. And we worked this out, quite honestly, in conjunction with the clerks, because they felt like, well, in many counties, most counties, they actually oversee elections. They've got to get the tax notices out, and they said, we can't deal with all of this. So so this would give us more time at you as the governing body to actually put together a budget and not impose on them those extra hardships. Before I get into this, I want to mention a couple of other things. Some interesting developments. The governor had assembled a tax council made up of a number of citizens, private, former legislators from around the state. In fact, our former county administrator, Dennis Hayes, is serving on that organization, that council. They've been looking at a comprehensive view of the tax base in Kansas and are expected the week after Thanksgiving to meet again and make a couple of recommendations, preliminary recommendations to the 2020 legislature. They will then continue to meet throughout 2020 and recommend some final decisions for the 2021 session. But the interesting point I wanted to make was the other day, one of the members, one of the chairs of that committee, former Senate President Steve Morris, raised an interesting point, and he said that he thinks that the legislature should seriously look at restarting the LAVTR, the Local Ad Valorem Tax Reduction Funding, which was stopped in 2003. It was revenue sharing that was negotiated between cities, counties, and the state way back 50 plus years ago. And just a little history on that, cities gave up a lot of taxing authority on sales taxes in order to make that simpler and for the state to do it in exchange for sharing that revenue back with us. Well, the state, given the financial situation they were in 2003, stopped that. And so it's been, 16 years since we received that funding. This year, I researched this year, had that still been in place, the Wyandotte County, KCK, the unified government would have received $2.6 million in revenue sharing. Cities and counties combined, since that stopped, have lost over $2 billion in revenue over those 16 years. And the whole point of the LABTR is to help reduce property taxes, keep the mill levy down by providing that shared sales tax revenue. So I just mention it as something I'm keeping an eye on, and I'm not terribly optimistic that it'll get restarted because it would require the state to actually come up with the money to fund it. But it was an interesting discussion, and so we'll keep an eye on that. I don't want to get into a lot of detail on the federal agenda, but it's largely the same as last year. But
Well, before we move on, I just have a couple things. First of all, is there any movement at all to restore prevailing wage? Yes.
Unfortunately, I've tried for 6 years, but I do have a bill that is still alive. And if I can get a hearing on it, hopefully we can get some momentum going, but that has been a challenge. I would have had it out of committee if the speaker wouldn't have called my seatmate right next to me during the committee and asked him to vote against it, and he had voted for it for 3 times. So anyway, it's a challenge. I'll keep trying. And I know the delegation as a whole supports that, and we've all advocated for it, so.
Thank you. Yeah, one other point, under energy and environmental mandates, the statement is, and so, I think we ought to amend this before we actually adopt and we come to vote. Unified government opposes federal and state mandates which regulate the operations of municipal electrics, water, solid waste, stormwater communications, and broadband utility services. I think that's an overstatement. I don't think we oppose all federal regulation or state regulation of our operations. I think that's a kind of a fruitless statement. Now, at the same time, any mandates imposed on cities should come with adequate funding to address the mandate. Yeah, I think that's also kind of an overshoot. I think, obviously, one of the reasons why utility rates are where they are is because the environmental mandates that have come down the last 10 years. So, and that was passed on to customers. But I just think that first statement certainly is an overstatement. Commissioner Kane?
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to support the part about the casino gaming. Unified government supports legislation measure which assists the Woodlands in reopening its gaming facilities so as long as the owners make a good faith effort to work with the unified government overall development. I think that's huge. But Michael, I don't see the food sales tax on here anywhere.
You don't see it because I didn't put it in here. I can certainly add that. I was viewing that as really an issue for the state. I mean, I would be happy to put in something that says we would support a reduction in the food sales tax.
One of the biggest complaints I get is food sale tax. So I think we should add it on there.
Okay. There's consensus to do that. I would be happy to do that.
I'm sorry?
I've got a question about it. Is it Missouri that has eliminated the state portion of their food sales tax, but you still pay a small portion? I'd be in favor of removing the state portion of the food sales tax. Sorry, guys. Are you in favor of removing the local portion and keeping the state portion? All of the above.
I want to talk about the tax lid issue. Just kind of slid down as a priority. It's still something out there to be discussed by local government. The other issue, Mike, you talked about the LAVTR. I did introduce a bill last year to put $40 million back into the formula to that revenue sharing, and the numbers you quoted are pretty accurate, having read through the study this last election, or last session, prior to introducing the bill. And my understanding is the governor's even looking at the LAVTR issue. So I do hope that that revenue sharing starts coming back to the cities. When we were in dire straits on the state side, those dollars were captured and were never re-implemented. And as you stated, $2 billion is a lot of money to withhold from local governments, what affects all the programs and services that we want to provide as a city. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But there is a bill out there to put $40 million into the formula as a starting point. And the other one was a tax lid. Do we know if that is going to be discussed? Are we going to find remedies or dealing with the tax lid again this session in reference to?
We're always making that effort, and of course, our baseline position is we want it repealed. We don't see that happening, so we've proposed through the league and the Association of Counties, and we've supported this, some other exemptions that would make it perhaps a little easier to work with. One of them that we supported last year and actually got a hearing is a 5-year look back. And so the way that would work, and it didn't advance out of committee, although we had a pretty good hearing on it. So the way that would work, if we lowered, as we have done, our mill levy, but suddenly an economic disaster hits, a recession again, we would be able to raise the mill levy back to that level, the highest level it was within 5 years, without having to have an election. So that's why it's called the 5-year look back. So we'd lowered the mill levy, suddenly another recession or depression hits, we would be able to increase that mill levy without having to go to a public vote, as long as we didn't exceed that highest point. We got some favorable comments on that, although the committee did not pass it out of committee, but I think we may see that effort again. So I think there will be some work. We're finding now that most cities have figured out a way to make the tax lid work, and so support to get rid of it is kind of waning, quite honestly, and I think legislators have gotten used to it being there. Cities are figuring out how to deal with it. So while we would like to see it repealed, I don't see a huge push, but there's always still that legislation out there. I wanted to touch quickly on something in the federal agenda, and as I said, it's largely the same as last year, which very detailed, so I'm not going to go through all this. A lot of it looks at funding opportunities, mostly. I mean, we're not going to influence policy on Capitol Hill that much, except through getting funding. There's a new development we just learned about this past week, and it has to do with surface transportation block grants. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is looking at a proposal, and I'll remind you that Representative Sharice Davids serves on that committee. But what this would do is it would make more dollars directly available to local governments instead of sending so much money through KDOT or the state agencies. So in those local grants, those are generally a pass-through through the State Department of Transportation. This could potentially increase the revenue directly to local government by 10 to 15%. So we received $13.2 million in block grants in 2019. If you imagine a 10 to 15% increase in that, and the proposal basically says instead of passing that money to the state and then them sharing it back to you, we would send more of it directly to the local government. So I recommend we be very supportive of that, and we'll stay in touch with Representative Davids and see if we can't help shepherd that along, because it would be very beneficial to us. So other than that, I'll just open it up for any other discussion that you all may have.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Several years back, and I know it's been an ongoing issue at a concern of mine and other people's, is our Wyandotte County's infant mortality rate. We had been the top, which is a sad statistic, to be one or two with the highest infant mortality rates in the state. Do we know where we're at on that?
We're still there. We're still there, yeah.
We did add, I don't know the numbers, Representative, but we did, at the request of the Health Department, add a proposal on, it's on page 8 of the federal agenda that you have. There's an issue about infant mortality, supporting the Mother's Offspring Mortality Morbidity Awareness Act. It's HR 1897, or called the MAMA Act, and it's funding for various programs to help that. It's also where we're recommending that we support HR 4768, which would double the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program funding from 400 million to 800 million nationally over 2 years. So we would presumably get a bigger share of that, and it would allow our health department then to engage more footwork in the community to visit homes and help homes with pregnant women with small kids. So we are supporting funding for those two programs because you're right, it is an issue here.
Senator Haley.
Thank you, Mayor. And I guess, well, beyond the concerns with day in, day out expenses that our Wyandotte Countyans have to live with beyond the BPU, which clearly half of our constituencies are concerned may be disproportionately high, and that rate payer study will be coming out along with the add-ons. And certainly I'll continue, as I mentioned, to try and raise those issues at the state level to find better balance and governance. An additional concern that many people that I've spoken with and that I hope that we can look toward stemming the tide on has come from our neighbors in Missouri with the property tax valuation in Kansas City, Missouri, and how that could disproportionately impact what they pay in their taxes, how it went from one year to the next. And I don't know, I know that we did have some of those issues that were addressed last year. We almost passed what was called the Golden Years bill. We were co-sponsors in the Senate that would give certain exemptions for property tax elevation to those who had lived in their primary residence and were of certain age for certain numbers of years, that there would only be a step increase and not a drastic one from one year to the next. I guess my question is beyond the golden years, which is incredibly popular among my constituents, many of our longtime homeowners who, beyond having to pay other bills like the BPU and the food sales tax and other things that nickel and dime them and pick their pockets, they're concerned about the property tax increase. And overnight, when alarmed because of Kansas City, Missouri, and what's happening over there with their appraisal. I would hope that the UG would support our efforts to continue to find some stopgap measures for drastic elevation in property taxes from one year to the next through property valuation.
Thank you. I remember the Golden Years legislation. I think it was introduced, I think, primarily by Senator Holland. We did not oppose that at all. I think there are some things that the states looked at also. It is put in the nomenclature as circuit breakers that have been actually taken away, or tax credits back to people who are renters even. There are some steps there that the legislature took away a few years ago that could be easily added back. One of the things I'll say in terms of the appraisal process in Kansas, and for better or worse, so much of it is dictated in the state constitution. So it's not easy, you can't just change it statutorily. So that complicates things. And given the constitutional language, if you put a cap on appraised values going up, like a value can't go up more than X percent in a given year, it creates a real situation where you're going to possibly create an unconstitutional situation. So yeah, there are things that can be done, and we would be glad to look at those, obviously. But from a legislative standpoint, you got to be careful how you do it because it's in the Constitution. But some of those things I don't think we would oppose, and I don't think there's anything in our program that says we would oppose those.
Ms. Representative Curtis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor. Pat Petty and I, Senator Petty and I recently attended a meeting, and an issue was brought up to us that we said that we would bring forward at this meeting, and that is the discretion on whether or not to check the box on U visas when you have a victim of crime who has come forward and reported a crime and is cooperating with law enforcement officials. When you have that situation, you want people to come forward and report crimes. That's the only way that we make our communities safer. And so several states have passed state legislation that removes the discretion on whether perhaps a local law enforcement looks at that and says whether or not that is a solvable crime and makes that discretion or whether or not to check that box. So it's an issue that we were asked to look into. I've asked legislative research to look at what other states are doing and see, how others are handling it. But we did promise that we would bring that issue forward here. So I am doing that so that you all are just, it's on your radar and that you're aware that there is some concern in our community about that.
Thank you, Mayor. Another concern in the community and the shootings that were on Central Avenue a while back that, the violence in the cities, and one of the most violent cities in Kansas is Topeka, which has been ranked as one of the most violent cities in the country. I've read the data on this. But I've had some retired police officers come and talk to me and also current police officers. A Hispanic, Mexican-American, or somebody liaison to the Latino community here in Wyandotte County. Somebody could reach out and maybe feel the pulse of what's going on. I think that's maybe paramount, that we can take a look at that, because we're seeing too many things happening. And I don't even know if the second gentleman, I won't call him a gentleman, has been apprehended that was in the shooting here on Central Avenue. I think he's probably still on the run. I think we're losing communications just based on what we see. I don't know what our law enforcement officer population looks like for the Latino community, I know expenses are always come into discussion as far as what we can afford and what prioritization of our funds are. I feel very strongly about that being, in the legislature and what I see around me, and also discussions around the different parts of my community as what is the city doing to help be more so protecting our Mexican-American, Hispanic populations when we see this type of situations happening around Central Avenue and different parts of our city. So I'm just putting a bug in your ear that I'd like to have further discussions on that and maybe see some data that with our Latino law enforcement officers, what they're seeing out there. If we can maybe look at having a liaison specifically to the Latino Hispanic community in the future. Yes.
I just want to say thank you for hosting us every year. This is very helpful for us to have this dialogue, particularly right, at this time before we go back into session. And it gives us a chance then to address some of the issues that you have, but it definitely helps to have this dialogue and to know all of you so that when we do get hot and heavy in the session and we need a quick answer, we know who to call and we have relationships that we've built, and it's just so very helpful. And I just want to say thank you so much for doing this every year.
Yes.
Thank you, Mayor, and ditto to what Representative Curtis said. But Mike, will you make sure you keep us very well informed on the property appraisal reform and the any efforts that might be starting out with the codifying of the hypothetical? That just could be so damaging to us. We could take a step forward with maybe getting potentially some more open-minded board members, and then this could happen. So I think we have to be on our game on that one.
Yes, it is our top issue. And we've got a number of other cities and counties. And I said, I always like to go in on an issue with a coalition, which is why I've met with the community college folks, the Association of School Boards, and kind of put it on their radar because it affects all of us. And so if that kind of legislation does get introduced, at least all of those groups, all of us as a big group can come in together and oppose that. We're still working on a strategy of whether we want to introduce our own legislation, and that's being weighed, and we see a number of us see some danger in doing that. But we're definitely keeping an eye out for legislation that might be introduced by that other side to codify that. So yes, I'll keep you very well informed of that.
And Mike, should you not want to introduce the bill, because I could see what damage could come from doing something like that, it might be well worth it to be prepared as to what you would put on the table should those in opposition to us addressing this issue come forward. So it may serve us well to work with a coalition to ensure that we're ready to go with those issues that we feel are important, that we need to protect, versus that way, if they throw something out, we're ready to respond right away instead of waiting and drafting a bill and let them pick us apart.
Yeah, very good. And I, I can send to all of you, well, certainly you in both your roles, but we've got a lot of information about some actual voted decisions that have affected Wyandotte County. I also have a number of those cases from Johnson County of how that's reduced or potentially could reduce their revenues. I'd be glad to provide all that to you. So you've got some, talking points in terms of here's a decision and here's what it did, because some of them are just absurd, quite honestly.
Commissioner Bynum.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to Representative Reese's comments about concerns about infant mortality. And it's still high, but I was able to look up through our community health assessment that was undertaken, the rates. And overall in the county, it's been able to decrease a tiny bit, down from 8.3 per thousand to 7.9. Unfortunately, there's a huge disparity in the African American community, still experiencing 12.9 per thousand. So there's a little tiny bit of good news in there and still some significant bad news. But what the commission has done is adopted a community health improvement plan, and it addresses issues across 4 priority areas, one of which clearly is access to health care. And within that is the Medicaid expansion components. So this is one of the reasons, just one of many reasons why we remain so hopeful and so supportive of the efforts that you all are undertaking with regard to Medicaid expansion. But I thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Commissioner. And we have been talking about this since Mayor Reardon was, and Kathleen Sebelius, Governor Sebelius appointed a blue chip commission to study this issue. And some of the blue chippers are still around and can supply with more data and some of the causes and effect for our infant mortality rates being so high. So maybe we can get together and discuss this later and find out who we can talk to. I appreciate you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of having enough time to eat and digest before our next meeting, we are adjourned. Thank you.